The afternoon was calm, and Eloise, a 6-year-old girl in her wheelchair, laughed softly as she petted her loyal companion, Magnus, a German shepherd with a thick coat and watchful eyes. Beside her, her grandfather, Walter, a man with sharp features and a graying beard, watched over her with a protective gaze. The outdoor cafe was bustling, the murmur of conversations blending with the gentle rustling of the wind. But Magnus remained alert. His instincts never failed. He was not just a dog. He was a guardian. Then, the sound of heavy boots and rough voices shattered the peaceful atmosphere. A group of bikers approached, their worn leather jackets gleaming under the dim evening light. Among them, a bald man with a hard expression, Gideon, walked with an unsettling arrogance. His eyes scanned the area with disdain until they locked onto Magnus. The dog did not look away. He did not blink. He just stared, motionless yet lethal. "What's your problem, huh? Why is this much staring at me?" Gideon sneered, his voice laced with irritation. Eloise, innocent yet firm, tried to intervene. "He's not a mutt. He's my best friend." But Gideon didn't care. With a cruel, thoughtless gesture, he lifted his leg and delivered a brutal kick to Magnus. The impact echoed like thunder. Eloise let out a choked gasp. Walter froze for a second, and the entire cafe fell silent. Magnus staggered back slightly, but then something changed. His eyes were no longer those of a regular dog. They were cold, calculated, eyes trained to identify threats and eliminate them. Gideon felt a shiver crawl up his spine. He had seen that look before. He knew this kind of animal. Magnus was not just a dog. He was a canine. And now Magnus was ready to strike. A tense silence hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The cafe patrons sat frozen in their seats, eyes darting between the towering biker and the German shepherd that now stood firm, his body rigid like a coiled spring. Magnus' ears pricked forward, his amber eyes locked onto Gideon with an intensity that sent a chill through the air. Gideon took a slow step back, his smirk faltering. He had dealt with aggressive dogs before, strays, guard dogs, even a few mean junkyard mutts. But this was different. Magnus wasn't growling wildly or barking like a cornered animal. He was calculating, assessing, waiting for the perfect moment. The precision in his stance, the lethal silence. It was something Gideon had only ever seen in trained K9 units. Walter, still gripping the handles of Eloise's wheelchair, stood abruptly, his jaw clenched. His voice was steady, but his eyes burned with quiet fury. "That was a mistake," Walter said, his words sharp as a blade. Gideon scoffed, attempting to mask the unease creeping into his gut. He turned to his crew for support, but they weren't laughing anymore. They had seen it too, the shift in Magnus, the sheer control he exuded. It was as if they were no longer looking at a pet, but a soldier trained for war. Magnus took a step forward. It was subtle, but it was enough to make Gideon flinch. The biker's fists clenched, trying to reclaim his dominance, but Magnus had already decided. He was the one in control now. Eloise's tiny fingers gripped the armrest of her wheelchair, her heart pounding against her ribs. She had never seen Magnus like this before. He had always been her protector, her gentle guardian, but now she saw something else, the warrior he had once been. "Easy, boy," Walter murmured, but there was no fear in his voice, only understanding. He knew Magnus was waiting, anticipating the next move. Gideon forced a chuckle, shaking his head. "It's just a dog," he muttered, but there was no conviction in his words. And then Magnus moved. With lightning speed, he lunged, not to bite, not to maul, but to intimidate. His powerful frame surged forward just enough to send Gideon stumbling backward, his boots scraping against the pavement. The biker lost his balance and crashed onto a nearby table, sending plates and cups flying. Gasps erupted from the onlookers. The cafe fell into stunned silence. Gideon's crew hesitated. For the first time, their leader looked small, vulnerable. Magnus stood over him, eyes never wavering, chest rising and falling in slow, deliberate breaths. Walter stepped forward and knelt beside Eloise. He placed a firm hand on Magnus' back, grounding him. The dog didn't move, but his muscles slowly relaxed under Walter's touch. "You were lucky," Walter said, his voice low and steady. "Magnus was trained to take down men twice your size. If he wanted to, you wouldn't be getting up." Gideon swallowed hard. His pride was bruised, but more than that, he knew Walter was telling the truth. Magnus hadn't attacked him. He had spared him, and somehow that was far more terrifying. Gideon scrambled to his feet, his face flushed red. Not just from embarrassment, but from something deeper, fear. His crew remained frozen, uncertain, waiting for him to make the next move. But for the first time, Gideon hesitated. His hands trembled slightly as he dusted himself off, his jaw tight. Magnus still stood his ground, unwavering, his chest rising and falling in slow, measured breaths. His gaze never left Gideon. He wasn't just staring at him, he was analyzing him, reading his every movement, every twitch, every nervous swallow. Walter exhaled, finally breaking the silence. "It's over," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Walk away while you can." But Gideon's pride wouldn't let him. He clenched his fists, nostrils flaring, trying to find some way to regain control of the situation. His gaze flickered to Magnus again, and something flashed in his expression. Recognition. His eyes widened slightly as if something deep in his memory had just clicked into place. "This dog," Gideon muttered under his breath. His fingers twitched at his sides. "Where did you get him?" Walter narrowed his eyes. "Why does it matter?" Gideon took a step forward, but this time it wasn't with aggression. It was with something closer to unease. He ignored the stares from his crew, ignored the lingering humiliation. Instead, his attention was solely on Magnus. "Dogs like this..." Gideon's voice was lower now, almost as if he was speaking to himself. "They don't just end up in the hands of regular people. Not after what they've been trained to do." Eloise frowned, her small fingers gripping Magnus' fur protectively. "He's ours," she said defiantly. "He's part of our family." Gideon barely heard her. His mind was racing. He had seen dogs like Magnus before, but not in the streets. Not in some cafe protecting a little girl. No, dogs like Magnus were found on battlefields. His breath hitched, his fingers curled tighter. He knew exactly what kind of dog Magnus was, and he had seen what they were capable of. Walter, watching Gideon's reaction, felt something shift in the air. This wasn't just some street thug trying to act tough. This was a man who had seen things, who knew things. "You recognize him, don't you?" Walter said carefully. Gideon's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. He took another step back, shaking his head. "This dog, he was military," Gideon finally muttered. "Wasn't he?" Walter didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced at Magnus, who still hadn't moved an inch. His silence was enough of a confirmation. Gideon let out a hollow laugh, running a hand over his shaved head. His cocky bravado was gone. "Damn," he whispered. His eyes darted to Magnus again, lingering this time. There was no mistaking it. That look, that presence. Memories he had long buried began to resurface. Sand, explosions, the sound of barking mixed with gunfire, a shadow moving too fast to react to, and then teeth. He had seen a dog like Magnus before, and it hadn't ended well. His hands twitched involuntarily, scars along his forearm seeming to burn under the weight of memory. Walter saw it. The way Gideon's posture had shifted from arrogance to something else entirely. And that's when he knew this wasn't over. The cafe had fallen into complete silence, but the tension in the air was deafening. Gideon stood stiff, his eyes locked onto Magnus, his breathing uneven. Just moments ago, he had been the aggressor, radiating confidence and control. But now, he looked like a man who had just come face to face with something he had long feared. Walter saw it clearly, the recognition, the unease, the way Gideon's hands twitched at his sides. This was no longer just about a dog. This was about something buried deep in Gideon's past. Gideon exhaled sharply and dragged a hand over his face, his fingers brushing against a faint scar near his temple. His voice, when he finally spoke, was lower, rougher. "I've seen a dog like him before," he muttered. His crew was still behind him, watching, waiting for his next move, but he wasn't paying them any attention anymore. His focus was solely on Magnus. It was years ago, a different place, a different time. He flexed his fingers as if reliving an old pain buried deep beneath his skin. Walter remained quiet, but his jaw tightened. He knew exactly what Gideon was saying, even if the man hadn't spoken the words yet. Magnus' past was something he had spent years keeping buried, something he had tried to protect him from. But now, in a matter of minutes, the past had found them. The look in Gideon's eyes told him one thing: this wasn't just a hunch. He knew exactly what Magnus was. Gideon took a slow step forward, his posture no longer aggressive, but searching. "They didn't bark," he muttered, almost to himself. "Didn't make a sound. Just ghosts in the night." His fingers twitched again, a barely perceptible movement, but Walter caught it. Trained to take a man down before he even knew they were there, he let out a bitter chuckle, but it held no humor. "One of them got me once. Thought I was tough. Thought I was fast. Didn't matter. He was faster." He flexed his arm as if feeling the phantom pain of teeth sinking into flesh. Walter finally spoke, his voice measured. "And you think Magnus is one of them?" Gideon's eyes never left the dog. His expression was no longer one of mockery, but of certainty. "I don't think," he said quietly. "I know." Gideon took a deep breath, forcing himself to look away from Magnus, but the feeling in his chest didn't fade. The longer he stared at the dog, the more the memories clawed their way to the surface. He had spent years trying to forget, but now it was all coming back. The sand, the heat, the orders shouted over gunfire, and the shadows that moved faster than a man could react. He had seen a dog like this before, and it had nearly cost him his life. Walter saw the shift in Gideon's expression. It was no longer just suspicion or unease. It was recognition. His grip on Eloise's wheelchair tightened slightly. He had done everything he could to keep Magnus' past buried, to give him a new life. A life without war, without orders, without blood. But now, someone who understood exactly what Magnus had been trained for was standing right in front of them. "What's his real name?" Gideon asked suddenly, his voice steady but quiet. Walter hesitated. The name was classified. It wasn't something he ever spoke, not even to Eloise. But the way Gideon was looking at Magnus now, he already knew. Eloise frowned, glancing between the men. "His name is Magnus," she said, her voice small but certain. She didn't understand what they were really talking about. To her, Magnus had always been just that, her protector, her best friend. She didn't know that before he was Magnus, he had been something else entirely. Gideon shook his head. "That's not the name they gave him," he said grimly. His eyes darkened, and for the first time, he looked at Walter, not with arrogance, but with something closer to respect. "I've seen him before, or one just like him." He exhaled slowly. "I was in a convoy that got ambushed. I don't know how many guys they sent after us, but I know how many they sent back in body bags. And one of them was taken down by a dog just like yours." His jaw clenched. "They called him Ghost." Walter's stomach dropped, but he didn't let it show. That name, it should have been forgotten. Magnus didn't move, but his ears flicked slightly, as if somewhere deep in his memory, that name still meant something. Gideon took another step back, looking at the dog with something new in his eyes. Not just fear, not just respect, but understanding. And Walter knew then, this wasn't over. Walter felt his chest tighten at the name Ghost. It carried weight, a past that Magnus should have left behind. A past that Walter had worked hard to bury. That name wasn't meant to be spoken again. It didn't belong to the dog sitting protectively beside Eloise, watching the world with careful, trained eyes. It belonged to something else, a soldier, a weapon, a ghost of war. But as Gideon said the name aloud, something in Magnus' expression shifted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Walter saw it. A flicker of recognition, a moment of stillness. Somewhere deep in his memory, that name still existed. Gideon let out a slow breath and ran a hand over his face, looking like a man who had just unearthed something he wished had stayed buried. "I don't know how you got him," he muttered, shaking his head. "Dogs like him don't just disappear. Someone somewhere still has records. And if they find out he's here—" He trailed off, but Walter understood the warning. This wasn't over. Walter kept his expression steady, but inside, his mind was racing. He had taken Magnus in when no one else would, when they had deemed him too unstable for civilian life. But Walter had seen the truth. Magnus had never been unstable. He had been broken, shaped and used by people who saw him as nothing more than a tool, and then discarded when he was no longer useful. Walter had saved him from that life, given him a second chance. But now someone had recognized him, and if Gideon had, others could too. Eloise, still blissfully unaware of the tension surrounding her, gently stroked Magnus' fur, her tiny fingers gripping his thick coat with childlike innocence. "He's my dog," she said softly, her voice filled with certainty. To her, Magnus wasn't a war machine. He wasn't Ghost. He wasn't a threat, a liability, a name on some classified report. He was Magnus, her best friend. And to her, that was all that mattered. Gideon's eyes flickered toward the girl, and for the first time, his hardened expression softened. His lips pressed together in a tight line, his posture losing some of its tension. He let out another breath, his gaze shifting between Walter and Magnus. "I should walk away," he murmured almost to himself. "Forget I ever saw him." But then his eyes darkened again, his voice lowering. "But if I recognized him, someone else will too. And they won't just walk away." Walter met Gideon's gaze, his expression unwavering. He had known this day might come, that Magnus' past wasn't something that could be erased completely. But he had spent years making sure Magnus had a new life, one that wasn't defined by orders and violence. He wasn't about to let anyone take that away. Not now, not ever. His voice was quiet but firm. "Then I guess we'll be ready." Gideon's eyes lingered on Magnus for a long moment, his jaw tightening. There was an unspoken understanding between him and Walter now. They both knew what was coming. The past didn't just disappear, and a dog like Magnus didn't just get forgotten. If Gideon had recognized him, someone else would too. And not everyone would be content to simply walk away. Walter could see the inner conflict in Gideon's face. The man was no saint, but he wasn't a fool either. He had seen what these dogs were trained to do, what they were capable of. And if Magnus had been labeled too unstable for duty, then that meant only one thing: he was too dangerous for them to control. That made him a liability. And in the world Magnus had come from, liabilities didn't get to live quiet lives. They got eliminated. Gideon let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "Listen," he muttered, lowering his voice as he took a cautious step closer. "You think you've kept him hidden, but trust me, they don't just let dogs like him walk away. Someone out there knows exactly where he is. Maybe they've been watching, waiting for the right time." His gaze flickered to Eloise for just a second before returning to Walter. "And if they come, they won't care who gets in the way." Walter felt his stomach tighten. He had always known there was a risk in keeping Magnus, but he had hoped, after all these years, that they had managed to outrun it. He had built a quiet life, one where Magnus was more than just a weapon. He was family. But now, that peace felt fragile, like glass on the verge of shattering. Eloise, oblivious to the gravity of their conversation, gently patted Magnus' head. "He's not going anywhere," she said firmly, as if her words alone could make it true. Magnus remained still, his eyes steady and alert, as if he, too, understood that something had shifted. The threat was no longer in front of them. It was coming from somewhere they couldn't yet see. Gideon took a step back, his expression unreadable. "I don't have a reason to come after you," he said slowly. "But if I were you, I'd be watching my back, because someone else will." He turned to leave, his heavy boots crunching against the pavement. But before he disappeared down the street, he cast one last glance over his shoulder. "If they find him," he murmured, "they'll try to take him. And if that doesn't work, He hesitated, then finished with a grim certainty. "They'll make sure no one else ever does." Walter watched as Gideon walked away, his figure swallowed by the dimming light of the evening. A cold weight settled in his chest. This wasn't just a warning, it was a promise. The past hadn't just caught up with them. It was already here. Walter stood motionless, his fists clenched at his sides as Gideon disappeared down the street. The weight of his words lingered in the air, pressing against his chest like a slow-building storm. He had spent years keeping Magnus hidden, believing they had outrun the past. But now, the illusion of safety was crumbling. Someone out there knew. Someone was watching. And they were coming. Magnus sat beside Eloise, his body relaxed, but his eyes scanning their surroundings with silent precision. Walter had seen that look before, the stillness before the fight. Magnus wasn't just a pet, wasn't just a companion. Even after all this time, his instincts had never faded. He was waiting. Eloise, sensing the shift in the air, looked up at her grandfather. "Is Magnus in trouble?" she asked softly, her small hands gripping the dog's fur. She was too young to understand the full weight of the danger, but she knew enough. She had seen the tension in Walter's face, the way Magnus had stood ready when Gideon had approached. Walter forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "No, sweetheart," he said gently. "He's safe, and we'll keep him that way." But even as he spoke the words, doubt gnawed at the back of his mind. How long could he protect Magnus? How long before the people who had trained him, used him, discarded him, came to finish what they started? That night, Walter sat alone in the dim light of the living room, a glass of whiskey untouched on the table in front of him. Magnus lay at his feet, his ears flicking at every distant sound, every rustle of wind against the window. Walter ran a hand through his graying hair, old memories clawing their way back into his thoughts. He had walked away from that life years ago, but now it was walking back toward him. Then a noise, faint, barely there. But Magnus' head snapped up instantly, his ears locked onto something outside. Walter followed his gaze, his body tensing. The front porch light flickered once, then went dark. A chill ran through him. Someone was out there. Walter reached for the drawer beside him, his fingers wrapping around the cold steel of a pistol. The past hadn't just found them. It was standing at their door. The house was wrapped in silence, but Walter could feel the presence outside like a weight pressing against his chest. His grip on the pistol tightened as he remained seated, his senses sharp, his mind calculating the next move. At his feet, Magnus was motionless, but his body was tense, his ears flicking at every faint disturbance in the air. Something was coming, something trained, something that knew how to stalk a target without being seen. The porch light had gone out minutes ago, not from a power failure, not from the wind. Someone had taken it out on purpose. But what sent an even colder chill through Walter was the fact that he hadn't heard them approach. No careless footsteps, no scraping of boots against wood. Whoever was out there knew how to move like a ghost. And that meant they weren't here by accident. They had come for Magnus. Then it happened, a faint creak from the porch. A shift in weight. It was nearly imperceptible, but Walter caught it. They were testing him, seeing if anyone inside would react, waiting for signs of movement. But he didn't move, didn't let them know they'd been heard. He simply exhaled slowly, his pulse steady, his mind sharpening into a state he hadn't allowed himself to enter in years. Magnus let out a low, quiet growl, barely more than a vibration in the air. Walter reached down, brushing his fingers along the dog's back. "Not yet," he whispered. "Let them make the first mistake." Then a metallic click, the unmistakable sound of a lockpick sliding into the front door. Walter moved with controlled precision, flipping the deadbolt before they could get it open. At the same moment, he hit the light switch, plunging the house into complete darkness. They wouldn't have the advantage of sight anymore, but he would. A long silence, then a heavy thud, not at the front door, at the back of the house. Walter's stomach turned to ice. There was more than one. This wasn't just a break-in. This was an ambush. Magnus was already moving, his body low, slipping into the shadows like a trained soldier. Walter followed, pistol raised, his breath steady. He had spent years keeping Magnus hidden, keeping him safe. But the past had finally caught up with them. And Walter knew one thing for sure. If they were coming for Magnus, they'd have to go through him first. The house was swallowed in darkness, but Walter could feel the presence of the intruders closing in. His pulse was steady, his grip firm around the pistol. This wasn't a robbery. This wasn't a warning. The men outside weren't amateurs. They were trained, disciplined, moving like shadows. They had come for Magnus. A second thud at the back of the house. More than one, maybe three. They were spreading out, trying to box him in. Walter exhaled slowly, his years of experience kicking in. They thought they were hunting. They had no idea they had already become the prey. Magnus moved silently beside him, his body tense, his ears flicking toward every sound. Walter had seen him like this before. Not as a pet, not as a companion, but as a soldier. The instincts buried deep within him had resurfaced. He knew what was happening. He was ready. Then the door handle turned. The lock held, but the silence after was suffocating. They were about to breach. Walter moved first. A single gunshot shattered the quiet, aimed low, right at the base of the door. A muffled curse from the other side. One down. At the same time, the back window shattered. A figure slipped inside, landing in a crouch. But before he could react, Magnus was already airborne. A vicious snarl tore through the house as the massive German shepherd slammed into the intruder, his jaws clamping down on the man's forearm. A scream followed, raw, panicked. Magnus didn't let go. Walter turned, moving fast. A second intruder. He fired again, 1, 2 shots. The man crumpled before he could raise his weapon. 2 down. The last one tried to retreat. Walter heard the frantic steps, the hesitation, the realization that they had underestimated their targets. "Call them off," the man shouted. His voice was laced with something Walter had heard before. Fear. Walter stepped forward, his shadow stretching across the room. "You came to take him. That was your first mistake." He gestured toward Magnus, still holding the first attacker to the ground, his teeth deep in flesh. "Your second mistake was thinking this dog belonged to you." The last man hesitated for a fraction of a second, then turned to run. Walter fired once more. The bullet hit the wall inches from the intruder's head. A warning. "Tell whoever sent you," Walter said, his voice like steel. "If they come again, they won't be leaving." The man didn't look back. He stumbled out the way he came, disappearing into the night. The house fell silent again, but the battle was over. Magnus finally released his hold, stepping back, his chest rising and falling with slow, controlled breaths. He looked up at Walter, waiting. Walter knelt down, pressing a hand against the dog's head. "We're safe," he murmured. "For now." But as he looked toward the shattered window, the blood on the floor, the stillness of the night outside, he knew the truth. They would be back. But next time they would be ready.